This program is brought to you by Emory University.
It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this morning, Dan Kramer. Dan is an electrophysiologist from Harvard Beth Israel. He is someone I've gotten to know over a number of years through the Greenwald Faculty Scholars Program. We share an interest in ethics and cardiology. That's a small number of people in this world who happen to do work in that space, and Dan is one of my close colleagues in that space. He's also a close colleague of Faisal Merchants and others within our program. And so it's really nice to have him here today. I'll let him tell a little bit of, I don't want to steal his thunder about the fact that we had to reschedule his visit because of some important events a number of years ago. But just really quickly to run through Dan's background. So Dan, like all good cardiologists, was a philosophy major. For those of you who don't know, I study philosophy. That's important to understand. That's the key to success in life. He was at Brown and then went to Harvard Medical School, also did public health training at the Harvard School of Public Health, did residency at Mass General, where he overlapped with a number of our faculty, and then went on to do cardiology fellowship and EP training at the BI. He also did a medical device fellowship at FDA and has developed a really highly productive career focusing on outcomes research, ethics, and health policy, and heads the digital health program, EP and digital health program within the Smith Center for Outcomes Research at the Beth Israel. He's had funding from NIH, Greenwald, PCORI, and others, and we're in for a real treat today. So Dan, thanks so much for making the trip. Wonderful to have you here a few years later than planned, and I look forward to your talk.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate the invitation, and in particular that it was a 5-year rain check. The original date for this talk was April of 2020. I had tickets booked, and then sort of everything sort of fell apart. And as luck would have it, sort of unrelated to the pandemic, actually right around that time or shortly after, I moved to London and lived for 3 years there with my family, worked at Imperial College and in the NHS system, and was embedded in a group thinking about telemedicine, digital health, connected care, and all of that experience on the heels of the pandemic established the foundation for the work that I'll describe here today. So thanks again for re-extending the invitation and having me. These are my disclosures, sort of mostly public funding and nothing with regard to industry that really reflects on the topic for today. So this is what I hope to discuss in the next hour, sort of a little bit about the clinical motivation for the clinical trial that we're hoping to launch in the next several months. A little bit of work about the study design considerations and how we're trying to put this project together. And then I want to spend some time considering the barriers to having this trial that we're putting so much energy and effort into. What will prevent it from actually changing policy and practice the way that we hope that it will? And then with Neil here in particular, I'd love to spend a few minutes towards the end thinking about the ethics of comparative effectiveness studies, the infrastructure around the kind of work that we're trying to do. So in Boston, we love to show people the ether dome and reflect on this first public demonstration of anesthesia and all the medical progress that emerged afterwards. And when I was living in London, the faculty at Imperial College are equally proud of the achievements of Augustus Waller, who is sort of underappreciated relative to Eindhoven, who stole the Nobel Prize for it. But in London, they're particularly proud of this first human demonstration of electrocardiography in the 1880s. But to demonstrate this publicly, Dr. Waller had to train his assistant, Jimmy, to stand with his paws in jars of salt water. Despite contemporary accusations of animal cruelty, there's actually some wonderful primary literature describing the accusations that he and his laboratory got about what they were doing to this poor mastiff. But this is what was required to demonstrate how human electricity flowed through the heart in 140 years ago. And now anybody can really record an ECG from their own wrist and send it directly to the clinician. This is a tracing from one of my patients who'd had obscure palpitations for years. And thanks to the Apple Watch, was able to send me from a board meeting he was in while he was in this arrhythmia and could text me the PDF. And it's just extraordinary how connected we are to people and how easy this is to do now compared to its original description. But for all that sort of enthusiasm about wearables, digital devices to screen, to diagnose, to manage disease, EP has been doing this for decades. And I think it's important for us to understand what works and what doesn't work about these care systems and how the technology can outstrip the system's ability to support them all too quickly. And so for pacemakers and defibrillators, the early inventors of these devices recognized that they needed the systems to be able to store a lot of digital information, but also relay it to clinicians without having to bring patients physically into the office every time there was a question or a problem. So transtelephonic telemetry was how it was originally conceived. That was deployed in the 1970s, and then into the 80s and early 90s, inductive telemetry, requiring still a fair bit of patient wherewithal to have a unit in their home, put something over their chest on scheduled transmissions, and send patients into the office. And the real breakthrough came in the 90s with the incorporation both of wireless technology, first in defibrillators and then increasingly into pacemakers, but also incorporation of all these new diagnostic options, drawing on the ease with which embedded sensors for things like activity, motion, breathing patterns, those sorts of things could be embedded in the generators themselves, and all that information could be relayed to clinicians' offices. And the workflow has simplified and expanded, so it's become largely invisible. It's so good that we don't generally recognize and realize that it's happening in the background. And almost nobody outside of electrophysiology, and honestly, even inside electrophysiology, entirely understands how it works. But the basic idea is that for almost all pacemakers and defibrillators we implant now, there's the ability to send in information either through cellular connectivity, broadband, or increasingly Bluetooth. And all of that goes through whatever that connectivity pattern is to servers that are predominantly managed by manufacturers, and then that's to patients, clinicians through industry-specific portals or other means. And on the bottom, you can see where the technology lives for the 99% of the technology that we implant today. On the lower left is a typical device that has radio frequency technology, so patients need to have a standalone base station that sits in their home. And then 2 of the 4 major manufacturers have really leaned all in on Bluetooth technology. And here, the burden of that connectivity is shifted onto patients' smartphones. And so all of our patients in our lab at implant are paired with whichever remote monitoring system they're going to deploy. And so for those who have a Bluetooth system, we encourage them to use this, download the app. We admittedly have the manufacturer representatives sort of walk patients through this, show them how it works, and get them connected. And this is sort of an early example and something we'll come back to of willing the ends of the system without the means, is that it's so complicated to actually explain to every patient how this works and to get them paired, to get them connected, to troubleshoot that system, that is far outstretched all of the resources available to us to do this clinically. And so the way we paper that over is by leaning on our industry representatives who are there, who of course are always happy to see you and always happy to help because that's sort of their professional obligation. And they help get our patients educated and connected to these systems. We'll talk more about the way in which industry supports this work and how that's unsustainable in a few minutes. So there's this enormous sort of device clinic industrial complex now that exists and is, I would argue, sort of teetering on the edge. Every device clinic, I imagine, including yours, has sort of something like a device clinic mission control. And most systems now are so busy with so much information coming in that they can't actually individually navigate each of the manufacturer's individual portals. And so most people in most clinics use some kind of third-party software system that's typically cloud-based. It's a database that's synced to electronic health records. It's a way in which you can manage all of this remote data flowing in while also keeping track of which of your patients are affected by which advisories, which is unfortunately an endemic problem to our field. And there's a single portal staff can log into, and it's incredibly efficient for navigating sort of an entire device clinic population. And when it works, it's extremely powerful. And so these are sort of 2 paradigm cases where remote monitoring has been known to be useful and it's demonstrated its value. In the upper left is a typical graphic that we would see in an alert transmission from a patient with a defibrillator lead fracture. And so among the things that these systems manage and monitor all the time is the impedance of the leads, or the integrity of electricity flowing through them. And a sudden change here can be indicated indicate a lead fracture, and this can be sent to clinics automatically. Lower right, a transmission for one of my patients who was traveling and happened to have a Bluetooth-enabled defibrillator, was able to send me a recording of an event that he thought he had a bad dream or woke up in a cold sweat, wasn't sure what happened, and in fact, he'd been shocked. And being able to manage that from afar is incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. But the actual amount of information beyond those sort of one-off circumstances where it's extremely helpful, the amount of information we're collecting it's absolutely staggering. The devices are collecting minute-to-minute data across a host of parameters that are well beyond the main function of the devices and the main purpose of remote monitoring, which from its original conception was to help keep track of battery life and lead integrity and new arrhythmias. They're collecting all sorts of other things now, most of which I would argue we don't really know what to do with, but we're collecting it and looking at it anyway. So this is just one example from one patient with a heart failure enabled defibrillator that collects all this information about impedance, heart sounds, respiratory rate, nighttime heart rates, all these other things, and tries to pair this together into an algorithm that we think has some prognostic and maybe some clinical management utility. But it's so much information that there's no actual way that any clinic, no matter how well staffed, can look at all of it sort of day to day, month to month. It's not just a practical and clinical and probably a medical legal issue, but it's an example of where we're putting more and more of these devices in patients, connecting all of them, collecting as much data as possible. And yet we know there's sort of a clinical fiction that we can't possibly look at everything that's being collected. And so I wanted to spend a minute on the terminology before we get into the data supporting this trial that we're trying to propose. And so remote monitoring is an umbrella term that encompasses several different distinct device-related encounters. And that's sort of the unit of health resource utilization that I'm particularly interested in. So remote interrogations are either scheduled predominantly or sometimes patient-initiated transmissions that are largely replicating in-office interrogations where you get information about the battery, the wire function, new arrhythmias, and can change the programming. Remotely, at least for now, we can't change the programming, but we can collect just about everything you could get from a patient in person. Most devices are now also empowered to provide something like daily surveillance of device functions. They'll identify parameters extending beyond the normal conditions for that particular device and the wires connected to it. And when those parameters are exceeded, there's an automatic alert. It's not immediate, as we'll talk about, but it's something like daily or prompt, at least, generation of findings through that surveillance that gets sent to clinician offices. And then in-person evaluations are things that we're all familiar with, that even as recently as my fellowship were routine every 3 to 6 months in almost everybody with a pacemaker defibrillator, regardless of their clinical stability. These sorts of things, of course, also happen in emergency rooms, inpatient settings for various reasons, or can be unscheduled for things like MRI, for surgery, or patient symptoms. There have been several trials and many observational studies that show that remote monitoring, collectively understood, is useful. And ECOS is one of those studies. I'm just going to highlight a few findings here. This was a study from now about 15 years ago, showing 430 patients with defibrillators randomized to home monitoring, which is one of the proprietary remote monitoring platforms by Biotronic. And here it was still uncertain whether in-person evaluations could be replaced entirely by these remote interrogations. So here they randomized patients between an annual in-person evaluation with daily monitoring from this remote system versus an in-person evaluation alone every 6 months. What they showed, there's no difference in major adverse cardiac events, but a sharp reduction in total visits. And so one of the questions that was being explored here is whether if you take away scheduled in-office visits from patients, are they just going to show up anyway? Are they going to kind of find a reason to just make their way into the clinic because they're anxious about the function of the device? And they showed in this case that that was not true. You could reassure patients that the remote monitoring was playing the same role as in-office evaluations. And I think the more compelling finding from this study was the ability of remote monitoring far beyond what you could achieve through in-office evaluations alone to identify and prevent patient harm. And here, the particular outcome of interest was reducing inappropriate shocks, which compared to 15 years ago, I would argue are less common in general, but in this era of defibrillator therapy, it was very common. And here, remote monitoring, identifying things like SVTs, oversensing on the lead, T-wave oversensing, et cetera, lead dysfunction, all of this could be identified incredibly quickly through remote monitoring. It is very tedious to do in office. So they prevented a tenfold difference in inappropriate shocks through the deployment of remote monitoring. Another study illustrating that you could replace in-office evaluations safely with remote transmissions alone was called RM alone. And here, a more heterogeneous group of patients, both pacemakers and defibrillators, similarly randomized to remote interrogation, in this case, every 6 months versus in-person evaluation every 6 months. Again, they were worried about patients sort of sneaking back into the office to replace the visits they try to take out of their clinical pathway. But they actually successfully reduced in-office evaluations by 80% with no adverse impact on patient outcomes with overlapping event curves, as you can see on the upper right. So a slight uptick in unscheduled events, but the total in-person evaluations were dramatically reduced. And the last trial to mention is the TRUST study, which was also funded by a single manufacturer. In this case, was a bit larger, 1,500 patients, all with ICDs, randomized in a 1-to-2 fashion. And here they had in-person evaluations every 3 months, no remote monitoring in the control arm, compared to in-person evaluations only at 3 and 15 months after implant, with remote interrogations every 3 months, and then daily surveillance through this Biotronic home monitoring system. Here again, they found that they could reduce in-person evaluations by 50%. But what was particularly compelling in TRUST is that they were able to reduce the non-actionability of those in-office encounters, as well as alerts. And so what this means is that whenever there was an in-person evaluation in the study in the active arm or an alert from those patients, they were predominantly useful, right? It's one of the confounding things about practicing electrophysiology is you see the patients in the office, you check their devices in person, and overwhelmingly what you experience is totally normal function. And at least in Boston, patients will then complain about why it took them an hour to get into your office, took them 20 minutes to park, cost them $50 to park, et cetera, et cetera. I imagine it's similar here for a visit and an encounter that was almost tautologically destined to be totally normal and low yield. And it was this concept of actionability that the trust investigators studied. The other thing that they proved in line with the ACOST investigators is that you could identify events of clinical interest, AFib, VT, SVTs, incredibly quickly through remote monitoring in a way that would never be possible through conventional recordings. So all of these studies and other sort of more observational ones illustrated that remote monitoring is safe. You can use it to replace in-office evaluation, and this sort of converged to support the current guidelines. This is Christian Eriksen, former Hotspur star, who, as many people here know, had a cardiac arrest during the Euros several years ago, and is now playing in England with a defibrillator that I believe is transvenous. He's been cagey about his exact medical condition and what he's deployed, but based on interpretation of his uniform and sort of the way it looks, I think it's a transvenous system, which would mean that it's wireless. And so this is what someone like him would get. So he gets an in-clinic check still once or twice a year, as well as on demand if he needs an MRI, surgery, other sorts of things. He'll send in automatic transmissions every 90 days, and these are just scheduled into the background of the system. The patient never knows it's happening. It's sort of pulled out of their device. He'll set an alert if there's a sudden problem with his battery or wires or new arrhythmias. And then if he has his own symptoms, he can initiate his own transmission and send something on demand to his clinician's office. And this is what it sort of looks like codified in the Heart Rhythm Society guidelines, that every person at implant should be paired with remote monitoring, get some sort of in-person evaluation shortly afterwards to confirm device stability, and then an annual in-office evaluation there seen at the top. And then towards the bottom are the remote interrogations that are scheduled into these systems. And again, patients generally don't know that this is happening unless they get a bill or a copayment or they see something pop up in their MyChart. Those happen every 3 months in perpetuity. And then in between, if patients have clinical events of interest, like a VT alert or an AF alert, those get sent to our offices automatically. It's a lot of information. And this is what is codified now, both in the guidelines, but also in reimbursement across both public and most private payers. And this might be too much of a good thing. So any single individual patient, that's not Christian Eriksen's chest x-ray, but a typical patient with a defibrillator sends in these sorts of events every 30 to 90 days, depending on how their insurance is set up and how their system is programmed. They'll send in alerts. They can do patient-initiated transmissions. There's ad hoc in-person things, as well as the scheduled in-person things. And any individual patient is sending in it's a mountain of data. And if you multiply that by the entire population of patients with these devices at a clinic like yours and mine follows, it's a mountain range. It's extraordinary. So our device clinic, which is considered modest in size, follows about 2,000 to 2,500 or so of these patients. I think the Emory one is twice that size. That's 14,000. 14,000. Okay, so it's not possible. We sort of cling to this fiction that we can actually pair everybody appropriately, follow everyone, make sure that they're connected, and look at all that data in something like a reasonable time frame. It's not real. It can't actually happen. And these continuous data flows, as much as we like to prioritize the importance of electrophysiology and cardiology generally, it has to be viewed in the context of all the other health data that are flowing into our health systems. And it's not just the wearables, the Apple Watches, the Fitbit data, other sort of things that are at least related to cardiology that come into our clinics. But patients are increasingly using other devices that send that same kind of remote information in. And whether it's cardiologists, pulmonologists, primary care doctors, somebody has to look at all this. So respiratory devices, diabetes systems, and increasingly even neurostimulators are sending in the same kind of data on something like the same tempo. And so we can't look at the pacemaker and ICD information only in isolation. It's part of that ecosystem of digital information that's flowing into and overwhelming clinics. And we looked at this from an economics perspective as well. This is an analysis we did with Ariel Stern from Harvard Business School and some of our medical students, trying to think about how much Medicare is going to be on the hook for this if current trends continue. And what we modeled was how many Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries at different levels of uptake shown on the x-axis here, with different numbers of chronic conditions that were capable through various kinds of devices, scales, implantables, wearables, et cetera, could actually participate in remote monitoring, which was accelerated by the pandemic. And depending on how many chronic conditions were being monitored and the tempo at which they were being sent in, the number of uptake, the estimates range from the kind of low single-digit billions all the way up to $40 or $50 billion per year just to Medicare fee-for-service alone. And this doesn't include the kinds of remote monitoring that EP actually does, right? This was separate from cardiac device monitoring, but was more of an RPM system. We did an analysis now 10 years ago that we're looking to update. And as of about 2015, Medicare fee-for-service alone, so only about half of the Medicare program, and of course not touching any of the private payers, was spending $200 million or so on all CIED evaluations, so both remote and in-person evaluations. And if you appreciate that remote monitoring, as I deployed in the guidelines here, is used by something like 50% of all the patients who are eligible. You extrapolate that to all the patients who could be connected, plus another 10 years of uptake and inflation, it's probably in the low billions now just for pacemakers and defibrillators. It's not sustainable. The other problem with this, as I mentioned, is that these encounters are low yield. And so by the end of today, when I log into Epic at the end of the afternoon, I'll have 10 or 20 of these to look at, and they're all normal. These are, Faisal gets these too, I'm sure. So I get something like 20 to 30 transmissions every day that I have to review. And I don't have a very big clinic as these things go. And every one of them, stable device and lead measurements, no arrhythmias, stable measurements, nothing happening. We just shuffle these again and again and again. And it's silly. It's not what we did for training. It's very low yield for patients. And to the extent that patients increasingly will log into their medical records and look at these things, they will ask, and it's not an inappropriate question, why are we billing for this if it's so simple and silly? And depending on the patient, particularly the ones who are themselves clinicians and have a sense of how these systems go, they know that reviewing this doesn't take very long. And so why was this sort of encounter codified in their insurance by $50, $100, whatever it is? We actually asked patients about this, and we also asked providers. And this is a study I did with one of our then fellows, now faculty, where we interviewed patients with pacemakers and defibrillators. And we also interviewed clinicians sort of caring for patients in this ecosystem to get a feel for whether it seems to be meeting their needs. Is this what they have in mind when we tell them that they're going to be monitored remotely and what they're getting out of it? And then we found there were a lot of conflicts between what we think we're delivering to patients and what they think that they are getting. And the most striking examples of that are when you ask patients and even clinicians, unfortunately, to distinguish between remote monitoring and inpatient telemetry. And there's an uncomfortable number of patients who think it's basically the same, that we're watching them all the time and that we will be notified immediately if something goes awry with their device. And these quotes sort of say it better than I can. The patient on the top left here, it's probably the same. I don't see how it would be any different whether I'm in the hospital and they're monitoring it or I'm doing it remotely. The technology is the same, where of course it is not. Similarly, patients, because that's generally how they think remote monitoring works, they think that if something goes wrong with their device, they should know about it right away, right? I should be informed immediately. I'll probably be on my way to the emergency room anyway as a patient. But actually, most device malfunction is silent. And so those of us who care for patients like this frequently will get angry or upset calls from patients about why a particular finding, when we report it to them, why wasn't this identified earlier? Or why wasn't I told about this earlier? And even the clinicians don't really know how this works. So this is from a non-electrophysiologist who was part of our study, just describing how we try to make sure that patients know this is not a 24-hour service. We're not watching them all the time, after hours, weekends, maybe kind of hard to know. And we have some blind spots in our system that we're constantly trying to work out with our technicians, our fellows, our third-party service to figure out the best way we can manage this. But we have to communicate more effectively, clearly than we do, that this is not like inpatient telemetry. And then the other complaint that was loud and clear from our patients is this issue about cost transparency, which as much as we try to educate patients about the nature of their financial responsibility for what's about to happen, doing this at the time that we implant the device, they clearly have a lot of other things on their mind, and most patients don't really collect it. The other thing that's complicated around this, and we heard this from patients as well, is that patients have, despite the device being in their bodies, have very little connection to the data that the device is aggregating day to day and sending to manufacturers and then to us. And there's a lot of funny, quirky legal things about the way that data are treated. This actually came up very recently in the tragic passing of Gene Hackman, that they used his pacemaker apparently to, at least in part, try to localize when things happened to him and what that was about. And pacemaker data has been used to against people's legal interests in a few different interesting court cases. Lots of interest in whether and in what way the data are secure from cybersecurity threats. And I've done a little bit of work in this space with Marie Moe, who's a cybersecurity researcher in Norway who happens to have a pacemaker herself. And so once she realized that these devices had wireless connectivity, she tried to hack her own device. That is possible to do. It's very difficult. We were part of the first group to actually demonstrate its feasibility with some of the equipment shown on the lower left here. This was set up in one of our libraries, a room like this at the Beth Israel, and several postdoc students with a lot of equipment, as well as a pound of bacon that they used to simulate the human heart, were able to show that they could hack into a device and get it to change its programming, but it was extremely difficult to do. But one of the things that makes it easier to do than it should be is that each company deploys remote monitoring and the connectivity of their systems a little bit differently, and it's all protected by proprietary technology and patents. And from a cybersecurity perspective, that's actually a bad thing. It makes it harder for cybersecurity researchers or federal regulators to establish certain standards. And that's just one of the kind of funny, quirky, idiosyncratic pieces around cardiac device management. I would guess that for the most part, for most patients, they don't have much of a say in what kind of device they get, what brand they get. It might have some influence over the design, depending on the context, but very few patients have strong views about which manufacturer they get. But it turns out there are some differences across manufacturers in the nature of their remote monitoring. So as I said earlier, only 2 of the 4 major manufacturers have pursued Bluetooth. And so for patients for whom that's important, it might depend on which device you get. And there are some other subtle differences in terms of how the remote monitoring works across platforms as well. So just to sort of summarize all of the, or at least some of the problems related to remote monitoring that our study is attempting to solve, is that all of this longitudinal care is overwhelming device clinics. The inbound data is overwhelming, and overwhelmingly it's normal, we're non-actionable. Patients get very little feedback about what's happening with their devices. No one really knows how it works. It varies idiosyncratically across manufacturers. It's not really meeting patients' needs well, and it's increasingly a burden on providers. It's very, very expensive to the healthcare system and also to individual patients. And this is despite the fact that only about half of the people who could be participating in it choose to do so. We tried to sort of summarize a strategy that would improve on this, working with Jamie Dimon, now one of your faculty members who was then one of our fellow, to think about whether the existing technology could support a different model for caring for these patients that would improve the signal to noise ratio, the low actionability issue, try to shift the volume-based incentives and policies around documenting the kinds of encounters that we participate in, even though we know that overwhelmingly they're non-actionable, and then see if there's a way in which we could overcome this inconsistent data format and alert conditions across different platforms. And the solution that we've landed on is this idea of alert-based care. And what we're drawing upon is these multiple trials, some of the ones I've showed before and a few others, showing that remote monitoring, as it's deployed now with the advanced technology, you can improve patient retention, you can get them to follow up in your clinic more reliably, you can reduce office visits and shorten the time to identify arrhythmias, and usually identify abnormal device function, even in devices that are under advisory, for which the usual recommendation is simply to connect them to remote monitoring. And we know now, this is a study we did with about 1,000 of our own patients, prospectively showing that remote transmissions of all types now are about half of all the evaluations total. Most of those are scheduled, most of those are normal. And we know those are low value and they're distracting and time consuming. But if you carefully program their alerts and you ensure that patients are connected, then you should be able to capture the things that you care the most about. And this is sort of a return to the original purpose of remote monitoring, which was with all the other sensors, heart failure monitoring, which I'm somewhat skeptical of. Really what we want to make sure is that the battery is working, the leads are working, and the patients aren't having new arrhythmias that we care about. And alert-based care can do that. And what would that look like? This is analysis from the TRUST study, sort of modeling out what this would look like in practice. And so at the top is sort of conventional in-person care, these blue circles every time a patient has an in-person evaluation. And the conventional strategy, which is what the guidelines codify now in the middle, is a variety of in-person, remote, scheduled, and then alert transmissions across the middle there. But the alert-driven approach, you make sure patients are initially tucked in and stable, and then you connect them, and then you just leave them alone. And if you don't need to see them in person for a clinically driven reason, then you don't. And if there's an alert condition sent from the device, then you review it. But otherwise, there isn't this pile up of paperwork in offices that we have to look at, and that we know is almost by definition going to be normal. And they did a variety of clinical and economic models showing that this would be cost effective, at least as clinically effective, and certainly less expensive, so economically dominant, sort of the lower right quadrant of that cost effectiveness graph. And there's been surprisingly sort of low enthusiasm for testing this prospectively, although now that I'm just trying to design a trial to do so, maybe I can understand why. But one study that did this on sort of a smaller scale was called the REFORM study, taking a relatively high-risk clinical patients with sort of made it two-like characteristics. And in this case, randomizing them to what they called the quarterly group. So these are scheduled remote transmissions every 90 days to those who had scheduled transmissions only at 15 and 27 months. But in the active arm on the this Y group, the yearly group, Nothing else happened to those patients. They weren't seen in person, and they didn't have a scheduled remote transmission either. So everything relied on alerts. They showed that this was safe. The adverse cardiac events were about the same. They were dramatically reduced the number of total device-related encounters. And it's maybe hard to see on the screen, but in the lower right, they actually measured quality of life and tried to get a sense for how well patients were served by this. And there were some positive trends towards suggesting that patients actually liked this better. They liked the idea that the emphasis was on connectivity, making sure that they were being watched without needing to see that documented every 90 days. And so based on this, we designed a study we've called the Remote Alert Pathway to Optimize the Care of CIEDs, or RAPTOR CIED. And the overall goals are to compare the safety and effectiveness of an alert-driven strategy versus the guideline-based long-term care for patients with wireless devices. But we're also very interested in exploring the experiences of patients as well as their providers within and between those different models, including patients who we aren't reaching with any remote monitoring at all, try to understand who those patients are and why they're choosing not to participate in this incredibly powerful clinical system. And this is the way the study looks. It's a pragmatic trial, and each box here, as I'm increasingly appreciating, has a number of its own pragmatic considerations that makes the study design difficult. But this is the basic idea of what we're hoping to do. So we're enrolling stable patients who have either new or chronic wireless devices. We're drawing from those two populations in parallel. Unlike nearly every study in remote monitoring that's ever been done, we're trying to enroll patients across all manufacturers, trying to make the study purposefully trilingual. Pacemakers, ICDs, CRT systems are all eligible. They have to be successfully enrolled in remote monitoring before we include them in our study and have some sort of stable follow-up clinical plan where they're receiving their care. And from those two populations, we're screening, recruiting, and randomizing them between the guidelines-based care that I described before, alerts, initiated transmissions by patients, the ad hoc interrogations that happen in person, the 90-day scheduled remote things, as well as an annual in-office interrogation versus our alert-driven pathway, which takes away the scheduled 90-day transmissions, as well as any standalone in-office interrogation that isn't clinically driven. We're not telling patients that they can't come see their doctors, that they can't have their device interrogated if there's a clinical reason to do so, to evaluate bi-V pacing or look at their VT or AF burden or something along those lines. But without a clinical rationale, those standalone device clinic appointments are taken out of their systems. And so formally, the aims that we're hoping to explore analytically, we want to prove that this is safe. We want to show that randomizing patients to alert-driven care has no adverse event hazard for a combined outpoint of major adverse cardiac events, as well as unplanned device-related procedures. We're looking at effectiveness to see if we can improve both the total number as well as the actionability of all their device-related encounters, remote, in-office, and in-hospital evaluations. And then there's this extensive effort that we're pursuing in partnership with the Open Notes Group, which is part of my hospital. And this is the sort of the think tank and research group that's responsible for actually giving patients access to all of their medical records. That they led the legislation to do this. So they're helping us use surveys and other methods to explore the patient and provider experiences of both of these clinical models. And as part of that, we're also hoping to recruit from each of our sites a handful of patients who are choosing not to participate in remote monitoring at all, to understand what the real and perceived barriers to participating in this turn out to be. And we hope that this will help us understand what future implementation efforts would look like to catch more patients and bring them into the system, even as we try to make that system more efficient. This study is funded by PCORI and has two different phases. There's a feasibility phase, which is what we're in now. And if this is successful, then we'll unfold into the main phase. So we're about 5 months in now to the phase in which we're designing and working out all the fine details of the protocol, coordinating our DSMB, which Dr. Merchant has kindly agreed to chair, and hoping over the next 6 to 9 months to launch the study, enroll and randomize 120 patients, and prove that we can actually do this. An important part of the study that we're now working out as well is that patients who we talked to before the study was funded were really interested in finding out if there was a way that they could get more information about the content of their transmissions. And so something we're trying to pilot here is for patients who opt into this in the alert-driven arm, is sending them something like a weekly text or email that gives them some information about their device. And it would be something like every Monday morning, we don't want to do this on a Friday night, but every Monday we'll message patients in a way that allows them to know that your device within the last week has successfully connected, the alert conditions have been evaluated, and everything's fine. Or the part we're still working out is, well, what if it's not fine? How do we put that in an email that patients, as well as the IRB and their clinicians will consider acceptable? And how do we do this all with in recognition of the limitations of HIPAA? But patients were very enthusiastic about this. And as part of the nature of a PCORI-funded study, even before the grant was submitted, there's an extensive engagement period where I spoke to a number of patients as well as the stakeholders on the right, sort of the FDA, Medicare, all the different manufacturers, our professional societies, number of patient advocates who lead these patient advocacy organizations you can see here, as well as a variety of other clinical experts. And it was this delivery of more of their own information back to patients that was incredibly compelling to our clinician advocates and the patient advocacy groups that we spoke to. And so this is our formal patient and stakeholder advisory board. And so this group has been advising on the study really from initial conception all the way through its funding and now in the design and hopefully soon the implementation of it. And so in the time we have left, I want to speak a little bit about sort of the barriers to having a study like this, even if it's successful, actually change policy and practice. So we're spending a lot of time on this, a lot of money, a lot of effort. And we want to do this not just to sort of fill the days, but to actually change the way this model of care is delivered to patients worldwide. And I've tried to do this once before, and I don't know what the state of the art for this is here. But about 10 years ago, it was extremely difficult in Boston to get any patient an MRI with almost any combination of defibrillator or pacemaker generator and lead. And in reviewing the literature that was available at the time, we sort of decided that this didn't make any sense. And the Medicare policy at the time, as many of you may remember, was that you could only get an off-label MRI if you were part of a Medicare-approved registry or clinical study testing the safety and feasibility of doing so. We did our own study, and we sort of replicated what the Hopkins group and the MagnaSafe study did sort of around the same time that they were doing it, published our results, showed that this is very, very safe. And then we wrote a sort of parallel article showing that we and others have shown that this is as safe as it can possibly be. We've done, in the 10 years since we've had a program, we've done thousands of these cases. I think you have a program as well. MagnaSafe and the Hopkins registry were published showing thousands and thousands of patients went through this pathway safely, and nothing happens to people. But the Medicare guidelines remain an important barrier to patients actually getting this service. And it's hard to overstate the impact of this on patients. Like the overwhelming majority of patients at our hospital who get MRIs in this context, it's for central nervous system conditions or cancer, things that really can't be managed any other way. And so we were sort of so frustrated about this that I worked with Aaron Kesselheim, and we wrote sort of a piece illustrating how this particular clinical area illustrates a real problem with this coverage with evidence development program, which is the pathway through which Medicare will conditionally approve a service, but only if patients are part of a clinical study. And the question that we posed is, well, how does Medicare know when it's time to change a policy? How have they decided that you've done enough? And then at the time that we wrote this, there were thousands of patients in the literature showing that if you program the devices correctly, which is really not that much different from what we do to these devices before patients go through surgery, nothing happens. These are like the most boring tables 2 ever. There's no adverse events if you do this. So we wrote this article, and then we reached out to Medicare directly, because it turns out, how do they decide when to do it? The criteria are actually quite ambiguous, but at least some of it seems to be, well, when clinicians in the field email us and tell us, hey, this has to change, or your policy is out of date. And they were, the Medicare Coverage and Analysis Group is incredibly underfunded. It's tiny compared to FDA. Exactly what their staffing levels look like today may be hard to guess, but it's certainly dwarfed by what the FDA has. It's a relatively small group of people. They could probably fit in this room, and they're responsible for dictating coverage policy for all the services that Medicare beneficiaries receive. So I reached out to them, and along with Paul Friedman, we hosted a webinar, we reviewed all the information, and I think we were part of the movement to encourage them to revisit this particular policy. And then so a year or so later, they published their new policy, and that's great. And our work was cited, we felt good about that, but it had some unintended consequences, which we also wrote about, which is that the way they shifted their coverage for this particular service is that they sunsetted all those registries. So those, you didn't have to be in one anymore, but they excluded patients with capped or epicardial leads, which is a small but not unimportant proportion of patients who have these devices. So now, depending on your interpretation of the policy and how creative your billing and coding people are, patients with these leads were actually made worse off than they were in the previous system. They were excluded from coverage, and there was no coverage with evidence development workaround to get those patients scans that they need. And we did it anyway, and lots of places do. But this is just an example of how changing policy can sometimes have unintended consequences. And so we'll take what we do, hopefully several years from now, to Medicare again, but I have some concerns about whether and in what way the policy will change, and also in which, how it will affect clinical practice. And for these reasons, and this is just a snapshot from the official Medicare guidelines around how payment for this service is codified. And what I would emphasize here is just that the episode-based reimbursement is really the tether around which the entire remote monitoring and device clinic ecosystem is built. You can't bill for anything that you don't document. Like that's true across a lot of other fields and other things that we do. And there's a lot of very heavy documentation about sort of how physicians have to personally look at this data and that data, generate a report, sign it independently, and do all of those things. Even though the original motivation from the Heart Rhythm Society, Bruce Wilcoff, and others who sort of advocated for the original coverage decisions, it was more about the period of monitoring. We really needed patients to be watched, and this needed to be a covered service because it's difficult to do well. But unfortunately, it landed on the system where you can't get paid for anything that you don't document and that you do. And so you were forced to document a lot of clinical activity that we know is incredibly useless, right? It's very, very low yield. And this system, one of the things that we're worried about is that, well, is it possible that we will prove that these 90-day transmissions, for example, or most in-office interrogations aren't necessary, and thus they just won't be paid for anymore? And it's hard for me to ignore that this one of my other roles in the hospital is overseeing the device clinic staffed by half a dozen people whose salaries are paid for by these exact policies that I'm hoping to change. And this is a graph from this paper we published 10 years ago, just again, kind of codifying the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that flow to people. They flow to device clinics, they flow to clinical salaries like mine, at least albeit indirectly. There's an entire ecosystem that depends on this. And one of the things I've heard in presenting versions of this work around the country is that private practices in particular actually depend quite a bit on this service because it's easy to do. And it's really easy to do if you lean on the device manufacturers who run a lot of community sort of device clinics, or they're called device clinics, so they don't look quite like ours, or I suspect yours. They're just offices in the community that have patients with pacemakers and defibrillators with particular manufacturers sort of stacked up on a particular day. And vendors from those representatives from those vendors will come and do most of the work, and the clinicians will bill for it. And it's a tidy little system in a lot of private practices. And that's the system that we're trying to change. But there are very, very firmly entrenched stakeholders who actually do pretty well with the system the way that it works. So this is, I think, an important barrier to our study having the impact that we hope it will. And what we've hoped we've accomplished by engaging Medicare as well as FDA at this early planning stage is set the stage and eventually not to take away all reimbursement for this service. I don't think that makes sense, but to change the way that it is reimbursed so that it can be more of a per patient per month or per patient per year of successful remote monitoring documented some other way besides my Epic inbox. So the last thing I want to talk about with the time we have left is something that we've increasingly appreciated as we try to design and launch this study, which is that the ethical infrastructure around this kind of comparative effectiveness research. We're not testing a new kind of defibrillator or a new kind of pacemaker. We're comparing strategies that are already deployed in practice. And this is harder to do perhaps than it should be. And there was an article published a few months ago in JAMA timed with the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Helsinki, sort of a seminal document in research ethics and human subject protection. This was published by Nancy Cass, Ruth Baden, and others. And they were making the claim that ethical oversight of all clinical trials needs to be reevaluated to make the regulations more fit for purpose. And what they observed is that the regulations now were developed because of these horrific abuses of authority in prior generations of medical research, but they might be overly broad when applied to comparative effectiveness studies in particular. So we're not talking about brand new early feasibility studies or truly explanatory phase 3 work, but phase 4 kind of projects in particular. And they observed that the failure to do important clinical comparative work exposes patients to a different but equally serious kind of harm as systemic via a sort of an error of omission. There's lots of questions that we can't answer because it's too difficult to compare patients through the way that research is traditionally overseen. And the federal rules, both the common rules and the FDA guidance, they're usually interpreted by most institutions and most IRBs to characterize minimal versus non-minimal risks holistically rather than what's really the added risk because of the research that's being done. And I'll describe that in a bit. And what they argued for is that the guidance and interpretations here need to be made less ambiguous to allow for more permissive structures for alterations or waivers of consent or information or opt-out strategies or other things other than the standard painful written consent process, even to randomized trials. And so the way that they frame this is that the questions we should really be asking, it's not the traditional minimal risk versus high risk paradigm that most IRBs deploy and make their decisions based on that. But what Drs. Cass and others propose is that we should think about research more in this context, which is, does the research question restrict patient choices that patients ordinarily are involved in, or maybe they should be, whether they are or not? And does it prevent patients from making meaningful decisions that have that can only be really made properly with an incorporation of patients' values and their own goals? And are the risks of study participation meaningfully different from what participants would experience in routine clinical care? So that's different from the way most IRBs, including our own, interpret the revised common rule as well as the associated FDA guidance. And this is what this looks like in practice. And Holly Fernandez-Lynch from Penn and I wrote about this in a companion piece to the Cass article. So these are two equally beautiful AF ablation maps. One is using an electroanatomic mapping system from Johnson & Johnson. The other one is from Abbott. And my guess is that whichever of the systems that you use here, whichever mapping system is deployed on a particular patient, it's not a choice that patients make. It's not a choice that patients care about, and nor should they, because they're basically the same. The choice between one or the other is usually operator dependent based on contracting, operator preferences. It doesn't matter. It's not a choice that patients ordinarily are involved with, and it's not one that really restricts their decisions and has nothing to do with the risk of the procedure. The context is a high-risk procedure as IRBs would consider it, right? It's general anesthesia usually, it's invasive, it's intracardiac, it's a transseptal puncture. But if you wanted to do a randomized study of, in this case, Cardo versus Insight, there's no way that any IRB in the country would let you do that without consenting patients. Absolutely no chance. Even though the risks of the specific research question are absolutely trivial. They have nothing to do. 99% of the risks that any of these patients would experience are baked into the experience that they're having clinically, right? And if this were, I'm not sure that this is a really important clinical question, but if it were, you could answer it in 6 months easily with a study that without consent randomized every patient, either patient to patient or cluster, or you could cluster yourself week to week. You could answer this incredibly quickly, and yet we can't because you actually couldn't do it at any institution that I'm aware of without consenting all these patients in that sort of ordinary painful way. And there are other questions that I think are actually more important clinically that suffer from that same sort of overbearing regulatory structure. So this is a study for which I'm on the steering committee. It's being done mostly in Europe. It's called the Protect study, and they're randomizing patients with bradycardia indications, predominantly for heart blocks, so patients who they think are going to pace a lot, between standard right ventricular pacing or conduction system pacing. And so you can see on the chest X-rays show that this is pretty similar, right? 95% of the procedure is basically the same, how you get access, where you put the leads. The atrial lead is the same in the patients for whom it's relevant. And the only difference is exactly where that right ventricular lead goes. And in the echo image here, it shows that in the conduction system pacing approach, it embeds in the septum, whereas in the RV septum, traditional RV pacing, it kind of goes where it goes or where you aim it. And that study, I would argue, is also slowed down, made much more expensive, and will be made probably the 10th the size that it might be otherwise because of the need for standard informed consent. And this, I don't know, Faisal, you can tell me how you approach this decision with patients here. In our lab, whether a patient with heart block gets conduction system pacing or traditional pacing, it matters a little bit like which operator is doing it and when in the era in which they trained, their personal enthusiasm for doing this. We don't usually talk about this with patients. We don't typically, there are settings where we certainly do, and we might inform them, but we don't usually ask them if they have a preference because it'd be hard to imagine which patients would actually express a strong preference for one or the other approach. They're in heart block, they want you to put a pacemaker in that's effective. And I think this is illustrative also of what are the potential downsides between one or another approach. The things that you worry most about for pacemaker implantation, the truly regrettable complications are perforation and lead dislodgement, both of which I think are arguably less common in patients who get conduction system pacing. So to the extent that patients are being exposed to something that's less established, if not exactly experimental, I think the incremental risks to whichever device they're getting are trivial. So right now, what patients get is pretty much idiosyncratic based on who's actually doing the procedure. They're not usually consented for this outside of the consent for the procedure itself. But the randomized trial is really trying to give us the highest quality evidence possible. Only will be able to enroll about 2,000 patients, and it's going to take them 4 or 5 years to do it. We could answer this question in about 6 months if we didn't deploy sort of standard informed consent, but instead, whether it's a cluster design or information or sort of an informed communication approach or other alterations, not a full waiver, but an alteration of consent could make this much, much more efficient. Another study that's, I think, confronting the same problem is the left versus left trial. This is also funded by Precori, so the organization in the US that's really the most committed to comparative effectiveness research. And this is shown on the top left here. I don't know if you're a site for this or not, but many of you may have heard it. This is led by Ken Ellenbogen and others. And this is comparing strategies for cardiac resynchronization therapy, comparing traditional coronary sinus left ventricular pacing to a strategy that pursues conduction system pacing up front. Similarly, this is not, if you think about the criteria that Cass outlined before, this is not a decision that patients are generally particularly engaged in, right? In our lab, we have some operators who are committed to doing conduction system pacing up front first. They think it's better, they think it's safer. Sometimes you can get away with fewer wires. Other people who think, the traditional method's been around for 25 years and it works, we should do that first and use conduction system pacing as a bailout. Patients don't generally care. I've actually tried to have this conversation with people before I've done devices. Mostly what they care about is not being in heart failure. And if there's a device that I, as their clinician, thinks is likely to work one way or the other, and some of the more technically oriented patients might like to hear about the different options and how the technology is advanced, they don't usually have a firm commitment to a strategy that endorses one or the other strategy first. They just want to not be in heart failure. But this study, which again, in this sort of repeating this pattern, will be probably twice as long and about a tenth the size that it might be otherwise because of the need to pursue formal written consent from all these patients. I'm not sure that this is a preference sensitive decision either. So even though patients typically aren't involved in this decision, and maybe don't necessarily need to be, this is deployed as if it's the same as something like CRTD versus CRTP, another question that I think would benefit from better comparative effectiveness research, but probably does need to have consent, even though patients are not as frequently engaged in that decision as we might like to believe. And the two other figures here are from a paper I did several years ago showing how that whether a patient gets a pacemaker or a defibrillator attached to their CRT system is largely driven by where they get their device. And so the graphic on the lower left is a model showing how facility tendency to implant either pacemakers or defibrillators is by a wide margin the most powerful factor indicating which device they're likely to get. And the graphic on the right sort of illustrates the same thing, but just by US state. So if you got a CRT system anywhere in the United States, whether you get a pacemaker or defibrillator will be driven by some things like your age, whether you have atrial fibrillation, other sorts of things, but it also has a lot to do with what state you're in. And that's hard to explain, right? It suggests that if you think about the CAS criteria, that patients are not typically engaged in that decision as much as you might think they ought to be. So they should be. And I would argue that if we were to do a study between CRTP and CRTD of sufficient size to answer the clinical question of which is more effective, that patient should be consented for because there the values do make a difference. But for things like the left versus left study, conduction system pacing versus traditional bradycardia pacing, and maybe for the kind of remote monitoring strategies that we're studying, it's not a patient study, it's not a decision that patients are typically engaged in, and they might not need to be. But that didn't work with our IRB. So these are just the first 12 pages of our consent form, which runs on for another 2 pages of signatures. And I'm not sure that this is helping anybody. It's certainly not helping me. It's not helping my team. It's not helping our study infrastructure. And it's making the study more difficult to do. And this is, everyone has seen these consent forms and knows how silly it is to do this, but it has real implications for study infrastructure, right? If we think about the budget to do a study like what we're trying to do, a lot of why it's expensive and a lot of why it's hard is actually getting people to sit down with patients, bring them in for their baseline visits, do those assessments, walk them through the consent form, and do all of that regulatory work. But you can imagine a version of our study, as well as the PROTECT study, left versus left, where none of that happens. All of the study energy, effort, and expense is focused on finding as many patients as possible, making the study as representative as possible, collecting only the data you need to answer the clinical question, and stripping away the pages and pages of legalese, which will just be stacked in virtual or actual binders and make those shelves sad without helping any of the patients who sign these forms. So I'll just wrap up to say that electrophysiology has been at the forefront of this, but we're collecting digital health data in a way that's never been easier. It's never been more granular, and there's never been more of it, and that will continue to happen. And as that's manifested for pacemakers and defibrillators, the management recommendations are effective, but they're onerous, it's expensive, and it's very, very inefficient. We're hopeful that an alert-based care pathway will focus clinical effort, patient engagement in a way that's more effective, really for population health, for us to manage the total population of patients with these devices, including those who are choosing not to participate in remote monitoring now, but could benefit from it. And then as we see our study unfold, we hope along the way, not just to change policy and practice around the specific service that we're studying, but I'm hoping we can continue to advance the conversation about whether we can better marry the research protections to protect patients who need it, but also only to the borders of what really are accepted ethical standards and no further beyond that. So thank you very much for inviting me again. Sorry, it took me 5 years to get here. Thank you to PCORI for funding this work, the Smith Center for supporting what we're doing, and then would be remiss without acknowledging my mentors, Dr. Josephson and Dr. Brock, for supporting this work. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dan. This was absolutely fabulous talk. Wonderful to have you here and sharing this really interesting work. I want to ask two, take advantage of my prerogative to ask two what I think are quick questions. But first, with regard to cost, I'm curious what, from an out-of-pocket cost perspective, are patients eager to forego that cost, or do they say, well, I'd rather just spend the $50 to make sure I'm protected, right? So I'm curious about that piece. And then the second, a really focused question related to the consent piece. Did you ever consider, propose, or have discussions with your IRB about a sort of pre-randomization consent model where you only consent people in the non-traditional mode of monitoring?
I'll answer the first question, the second question first, which is we spoke both to PCORI and also our IRB about ways of doing this that would avoid that 14 pages of gibberish, and it was loudly rejected. But on the bright side, our IRB and the chair of IRB, who I've known for a very long time, was transparent in acknowledging that he agreed with the underlying ethical principles that we are trying to deploy and what you're implying with sort of this approach to alteration of traditional consent. But what he and the rest of the IRB have admitted is that they feel tethered to the rules as they are currently expressed by the Office of Human Resource Protection. And so we reached out to the people we think are currently in charge of that office to see if we can get in front of them to argue for a change in guidance, because if that guidance changes, I think it empowers IRBs to change what they actually do. But the way the regulations are written and interpreted now, I think it's very unlikely that a study like ours could be done without traditional consent. Having said that, we didn't consent patients for our MRI study. And we were the only of the 8 or so national approved registries under that Medicare Coverage Evidence Development Program. We were the only one not to consent people. And the way we sold that both to Medicare, it took some work, but we sold that to Medicare and also to our IRB to say, well, look, we've set up this clinical program. We're just going to do this anyway. And we'd be doing it even if we didn't want to write up the results and publish it. And this is coming close. We didn't quite over the line, but we came close to this technique that a lot of people do where they sort of characterize what's really research as quality improvement, which is one way to dodge the IRB. It's not entirely ethical or probably legal, but it's a thing people do. And we came close to that line, but didn't go over it by saying correctly that this is a service we're offering clinically. We're not telling people that they're part of a study because they're not. We're going to be doing this whether we're doing it or not, but then we will conduct our study as if it's just record review, which is minimal risk and typically doesn't require consent. And that's how we got around that. But so that was your second question. The first question about the costs. When patients are aware of the cost at all, it's usually not with excitement, right? So one of the things the more engaged patients often will try to figure out how much this costs in advance, and we'll give them the CPT codes, and because we can't actually ever figure that out, we can give them the CPT codes and tell them to call their insurer to see if they could figure it out, or tell them what their individual burden would be. And depending on their deductibles and the time of year it is and all these sorts of things, it's extremely difficult to figure this out. The patients who find out about it and then appreciate the costs involved, usually you can explain to them why it's worth it, but not universally. The other thing I'll say is that since I was developing this study and presented some of this work in its early conception form in England, where patients aren't responsible for the costs, they were still actually sort of aggravated by the volume of services being done without their knowledge, or the number of times they had to come into the office to have their device checked, and they're more of a hub and spoke sort of system in the NHS, so it's often longer trips. And so even though they weren't financially responsible, at least directly, for what was happening to them, they still really like the idea of lightening the burden of health resource utilization one way or the other. Sort of a nice control for us to have patients who definitely are paying for it versus patients who definitely aren't, at least not directly. And they both really endorse this alert-driven approach.
Yeah, I just think this whole area is so fascinating. And one of the issues that you touched on is what when you put a device in a patient, like who actually owns that device? Okay, and it's interesting because I had a patient who once went in for an exchange, and he told the lab, he said, "When that comes out, I want it. You know, I want the device." And he ended up not getting it. You know, he had paid his 20% copay or whatever through Medicare. You know, he paid for it, whatever. And we're putting these devices into patients, and what are we actually telling them as far as the quote informed consent? You know, what is going to be monitored? How's the AFib setting going to be set? All these different things. So my question to you is, with your trainees, what do you train them as far as discussing what is the relationship between that patient's device and the patient, and what do they need to be told about that?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I would say with respect to the device kind of implant discussions in our trainees, that if there's something that I teach our fellows that's distinct from what they hear from other faculty, it's mostly making sure that they communicate to patients that the devices are good but not perfect, and that there's this sort of tonic possibility, even in the devices that haven't been recalled, that like for the defibrillator leads, for example, there's a small fraction % per year of those that will fracture. It happens. And communicating to patients that these devices have known and unknown failure rates as part of their experience living with the device is so important and not done all that well. As far as sort of the ownership of the device and the data, I don't think we communicate that all that effectively to patients. What we often hear from patients, or as part of the conversation about the sorts of data that we're collecting, they'll often ask if they can get it. Like, how do I get this if I want to do something with it myself? The way, like if you have a Garmin watch or Apple Watch, you can get some version of those, FIT files, and you can run your own analyses on your running data and that sort of thing if you want to. And these data, to your first question, they are legally all owned by Medtronic, Boston Scientific, Abbott, whomever. That even your own, like Boston Scientific, which listens to your heart sounds literally and incorporates that into their heart failure metrics, once they're processed by Boston Scientific's proprietary algorithms, they're not your heart sounds anymore. They actually belong to Boston Scientific. And whether you can get access to it, if you for some reason wanted to hear it, legally depends on where you live. So in Europe, the part of the context of the GDPR is it technically gives patients the right to ask for that data, and it technically commits those companies to give it to them if they ask for it in something like a useful or usable format. And that might also be true in California now, because they have a version of GDPR that's sort of trickling through the legislature and the courts, and whether it's deployed that way in practice is sort of unclear. But technically, legally, at least in the US, most of the data belong to the companies, and they have no obligation to give it back to you. They can sort of be obligated to give it to clinicians on behalf of their patients, who could then transfer it to patients if you really wanted to. But it's a blind spot in the way that the device ecosystem is built up. We also have patients ask for their generators back. And we used to have a program when I was a fellow where at least Medtronic would take the devices, clean them, and engrave them, and then mail them back to patients. They don't seem to do that anymore.
I was wondering if you had a plan on how you were gonna, with the transition to trying to do like less in-person monitoring for some of the heart failure metrics of, are you gonna be monitoring those, and in what time frame, on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, a yearly basis? And then where does that data go? Because a lot of my patients I see once a year, and that's when I do, get that information, because that's when I open up and look through all the device reports and I'm like, hey, this is what's been going on, but it would be great to get it sooner than that.
Yeah, so we're as we outline in the protocol, kind of, well, how are we going to program the alerts across the different kinds of devices and across the different manufacturers? We're allowing heart failure alerts to kind of flow to our heart failure clinic in a somewhat independent fashion, because those can be dissociated to some extent from the primary device related alerts. Where they go, actually, in our system, we don't have a particularly nimble clinical pathway for that. Our heart failure group does a lot of PA sensor monitoring, and those they have a pretty good structure for. I don't know if your experience has been different. I've been underwhelmed by the usefulness of heart failure monitoring in general. I think most of those systems, whether it's Medtronic's, Boston Scientific's, Abbott's, I think they've been able to show in large studies that they're prognostically helpful. That's not the same thing as showing that they're clinically useful, right? And everyone has seen patients who come into the office, they're stable, you interrogate the device and you see that their transvascular impedance has gone like this for the last several months, or it's gone in the direction that should indicate that the person is in shock, but they're fine. And so I personally haven't found it super useful. And I think our advanced heart failure and transplant group feels generally similar about the kinds of heart failure metrics that are built into most defibrillators. PA sensor recordings they do think are useful. So those they'll continue to get, but we don't actually have a good structure for processing that data.
Well, I think we're at time. Thanks again, Dan, for a wonderful talk. Appreciate your making the trip to be with us 5 years after COVID. And really wish you all the best with this really exciting trial.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.